Kathy Matsui has been credited by Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe as having coined the term womenomics. 17 years ago, she wrote a paper on the need for more women in the workforce in Japan. She called it womenomics. Today, wherever Kathy speaks, people listen.
So why womenomics? In fact, 70% of Japanese mothers quit working after their first child. What are the solutions? Basically, as far as I can tell, there are only three. Number one, raise the birth rate. Number two, change immigration laws. And number three, again, use half the population more effectively.
Kathy is an economic force in Japan. She was the first female to make partner at Goldman Sachs Japan. The Wall Street Journal named Kathy to its list of 10 women to watch in Asia.
There are a lot of social norms that may argue against having women participate fully in the workplace, especially after having started a family. So we need to start educating at home, in the schools, about why diversity is important for everybody in Japanese society. There's no such thing as a glass ceiling. It is just a thick layer of men.
Kathy was born and raised in Salinas, California. Her parents, Mary and Andy, immigrated from Japan in the early 1960s. They settled in Salinas and took a bold chance in starting a commercial flower farm. Today, Matsui Nursery is the largest producer of orchids in the country. Neither parent went to college, yet sent all four of their children to Harvard. Giving back is important to the Matsuis. The Family Foundation has given more than $5 million in college scholarships. 15 years ago, with two young children and a rising career in Japan, Kathy was diagnosed with breast cancer. She was just 36. She beat cancer and has not just survived, she has thrived. Meet Kathy Matsui.
Here to introduce Kathy is Susanna Basala, President and CEO of the U.S.-Japan Council.
Good evening. I'm delighted to join you from Mountain View to introduce Kathy Matsui, who is being honored by Asia Society Southern California as the 2021 Diversity Visionary. No one has done more than Kathy to champion women in Japan's workforce and more broadly in society. Her path-breaking 1999 study on womenomics started a national conversation that influenced a government policy on everything from daycare and parental leave to corporate transparency on the number of women employees and managers. Japan now has a higher participation rate of women in the labor force than both the United States and Europe. The numbers speak for themselves. I'd like to tell you about the women behind womenomics we've had the privilege to know through her board leadership in the U.S.-Japan Council, where Kathy models her deep commitment to the U.S.-Japan relationship through people-to-people ties. Kathy has the privilege of a seat at the most influential tables, yet she also uses her power to support communities and individuals who need extra support. Through our Tomodachi initiative, she's supported foster children and struggling new women entrepreneurs, and selflessly devoted even her weekends to encouraging young Japanese women. She mentors others, including in the Nikkei community, serving on numerous others' personal boards of director, a concept I learned from Kathy. She also has been a stalwart supporter at the Asian University of Women based in Bangladesh. Kathy will even carve out time to help a first-generation college student from her hometown of Salinas find his first job. And through it all, she brings her love of family as a daughter, wife, sister, and mother to her work-life integration, another term that I learned from Kathy. Thanks to her work, women in Japan and beyond have made great strides, and she would be the first to concede there is still much to be done. There is no doubt, however, that Kathy was way ahead of the curve in appreciating and then proving the advantages of gender diversity. Diversity and understanding are at the root of Asia Society's mission. So congratulations to Kathy for this greatly deserved honor. Now it's my pleasure to welcome Kathy for a fireside chat with Professor Carol Gluck, a noted Japan scholar at Columbia University and co-chair emeritus of Asia Society's Board of Trustees.
Thank you. Hello, everyone, and many congratulations to Kathy Matsui for an award well-deserved. And we thank you, the women of the world, the women of Japan. You're a model for us all. we've heard a bit about your own life and lives of your parents. I would like to ask you about how it happened that you wrote that report in 1999 that coined the word womenomics that Prime Minister Abe made national policy in 2013. What brought you to do that research that had that path-breaking outcome?
Sure. Thank you, Carol, for hosting this fireside. Thank you to the Asian Society of Southern California, and a special congratulations to my fellow honorees, Sabrina, Charles, and Vincent. So to your question, it's actually very simple. So I started my career back in 1990, worst possible timing, by the way, to start a career in the Japanese stock market right after the absolute peak of Japan's so-called asset bubble, right, which essentially peaked at the end of 1989. So I entered this industry thinking the sky is the limit. The Nikkei was already at 40,000. I thought we'd go to 50,000, 60,000 and beyond. Totally wrong. I landed my office seat in January of 1990, and the Nikkei index proceeds to collapse 40% in my first year. My colleagues were crying, my clients were writhing in pain with the losses they were experiencing. And frankly speaking, at the time, there were a lot of questions, very good questions being posed to me from investors around the world, such as, Kathy, why on earth should we even bother investing in an economy like Japan? After all, it was an economy mired in non-performing loans, bad debts, asset prices, stocks, property were falling. The fiscal deficit became, I called the Mount Fuji of fiscal deficits. And the demographic picture was extremely dire. And if you think about what are the drivers for any economy's growth, there are only three things. It's labor, capital, and productivity. And as you may know, even Japan's own government is projecting that Japan's workforce population, people between the ages of 15 and 64, is forecast to shrink by as much as 40%, 40, by 2055. So if that is halfway true, unless you see a productivity miracle, revolution occur, then Japan's economic prospects are indeed quite dreary. And so struck with these questions at the same time in my personal life, so this is 1999, in 1996, I'd given birth to my son. I took the standard Goldman Sachs maternity leave of 4 months. I returned full-time to work right after that. And then I looked around me and I realized that a lot of my mamatomo in Japanese, my Japanese mommy friends, many of them wanted to return to work as I had, but were unable to for a whole variety of reasons. They had CPAs, they were lawyers, many professional degrees, far more experienced than I was, yet they could not return to their workplaces. So I had these two, juxtaposed situations in my professional and my personal life. And I thought one thing that occurred to me in my brain at that moment was the classic Japanese term, mottainai. Those of you know Japanese in this audience will know that means waste. What a waste. The talent is being wasted, and Japan needs that talent. So as a research analyst, I have the privilege of playing with numbers. And so I decided, well, what if we could engage more women in Japan's workforce? At the time, Japan had one of the lowest female labor participation rates in the developed world. If we could raise that, however, what could that do to economic growth? So my thesis was really trying to talk about gender diversity, not in the human rights equality context, but really placing it front and center as an imperative for economic growth and business performance. And admittedly, it didn't take off immediately. That was 1999, that was 22 years ago. You just said that Prime Minister Abe picked it up in 2013. So yes, it took a while for it to gain traction, but I'm heartened now to see that it is no longer, or it's less questioned, the value of having a diverse workforce. It's no longer, oh, it's a zero-sum game, that the men complaining, oh, the women are going to take our jobs, so therefore there are none for us left. It's more about, we have a desperate situation on the demographic front, and this is part of the solution. I am not arguing that this is the entire solution, but this is a part of a solution that I think is a realistic one that needs to be addressed.
I see. Well, that, there are several things about that say a lot about you, Kathy. The first thing I think is that you went at the problem not with lamentation, but with research and with data, which makes a huge difference. The second thing is that you talked about economic outcomes rather than social or cultural ones. And I think that's really profound. So you had an effect, I think, for both those reasons, data and economic outcomes. So now I want to ask you, it has been 22 years. You wrote another report 20 years on in 2019 called Womenomics 5.0 about what had changed. So what has changed? You said there's more receptivity. What has changed since the 1999 report?
Sure. So like many of these very large concepts in any society, there are clearly some areas of improvement and clearly more work to be done. So let me start with the former. I would say, first of all, there has been, as was mentioned previously, there has been a huge and dramatic improvement, an increase in the number of Japanese women working outside the home. In fact, since 2013, since the government really started to embrace this concept of womenomics, 3.3 million Japanese women have found jobs outside the home than previously was the case, which boosted Japan's female labor participation rate, as Suzanne kindly pointed out earlier, to, of course, right before Corona, around 71%, which is higher than the US's 66% and the EU, Europe, at 63%. So number one, the numbers were had clearly improved. Number two, interestingly, transparency was super important. I always said you cannot manage what you don't measure. And indeed, in Japan's especially corporate case or corporate community, there was no obligation whatsoever for corporations to disclose their gender statistics in any regard, how many men versus how many women on the board, etc. But in 2015, this was, I think, landmark legislation. The government mandated that companies had to start disclosing their gender statistics and strongly encouraged to also set diversity targets. These are not quotas, but targets. And that really began what I call this healthy competition, because you can imagine, let's say in the construction sector, if company A put out a target for 20% of their managers to be female by 2030, and its competitor set out a target of 10, well, if you're a young woman graduating from a university here and you're looking to work in the construction sector, which one would you choose, right? It's pretty obvious. So I think that transparency and disclosure element was a huge step forward. Again, still not standardized data, still a lot of companies lagging behind, but it's a first step. And then finally, I would say parental leave benefits. 20 years ago, Japan's leave benefits weren't anything special. Today, however, interestingly, they are amongst the most generous in the world. How generous? The mother and the father each get 1 year each. And for the first half year of that leave, they receive up to 2/3 of their pre-leave pay, which is super generous. Now, of course, most of the moms take the leave, few of the fathers take the leave, so we still have a work to do there. But at least the benefit provision is actually world-class. Now let's turn quickly to what has not changed much,
Right.
So while we have more women working, a lot of those women, of course, are working part-time jobs as opposed to full-time. And hence, we still have a dearth of women in leadership and managerial positions in Japan society, both the corporate world as well as the public sector in addition. Just to give you a sense, only 15% of managers are women in Japan. I would say board directors falls in the 7 to 8% range, single digit. In the Diet or the parliament, the lower house of parliament, it's been pretty stagnant at about 10%. This is the reason why Japan always ranks very low on these global gender gap rankings. It is the dearth of women leaders. But having said that, you can't change things overnight. First, we need to get the women out of the home, working and fulfilling their potential, and hopefully over time working more full-time as opposed to part-time, and then encouraging them, I guess, internally within organizations to pursue a more leadership path.
So in other words, in terms of leadership positions, there's still a thick layer of men, right? In the leadership positions, right?
Sorry to all the men in the audience. I didn't mean it. That was a joke. That was a joke, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, well, no, it's true that there's an imbalance in the changes that have happened. But as you said, change comes slowly, and it comes particularly slowly, I think, in Japanese society in these areas. So now you brought us to the present. What do you think, or how do you see this unfolding in the future, whether it's the impact of the pandemic or new successive political administrations? What do you think will happen, particularly on the question of women in the workplace?
Sure. So related to the pandemic, while similar to everywhere in the world, women have suffered a disproportionate share of the damage from the pandemic, like everywhere else. Having said that, I would suggest that there is one silver lining, though, that has accrued from this pandemic, which is, Japan is famous for very long work hours. And despite government efforts to alter this, it's been very hard to change. But what the pandemic did was overnight, this option of work from home or telecommuting was no longer the option, it was the norm. And now companies are realizing they can actually get things done, be as productive working from home as they are in the office, right? And so I think this has really opened up, not just for women, but for men as well, for every part of the Japanese community, that there are different modes of working. We had one style that was very dominant, but now there are a lot of options. And I think that is huge going forward. Again, not just for women, but for every Japanese citizen. On the new administration, Suga, that has followed Abe, he has promised and committed to continuing the policy agenda that Abe pursued with respect to womenomics. I would say, in addition, that he's presented is, for example, subsidizing infertility treatments for women, which is quite expensive. Insurance doesn't cover, and that will be interesting to watch. But to me, it's not just about what is the government going to do for us, but I think at this juncture, going forward, what I said before about how do we encourage more women to pursue those leadership roles, there's a huge responsibility on the part of organizations or employers themselves to do that encouragement, which is why I published this book last year in Japanese on essentially how to nurture female employees. And I think that's kind of the next chapter of womenomics I see. Not that the government has done everything it can, it still has a lot to do, but I think the onus of responsibility also falls on the employers to figure out internally within the organizations, what are unconscious biases that need to be rectified? How are you evaluating your staff and compensating them? Is it seniority based, or can it be shifted to more performance-based system? Are you going beyond mentorship into the realm of sponsorship? So many things that can be done at that practical micro level. So I think the future does look optimistic. And if I can just finally add, there are two things that do make me optimistic, because I know there's a lot of observations on this topic, especially in the Western media, that are very negative. But two things that make me optimistic. Number one, young Japanese men are very different from their fathers and grandfathers. I just retired from Goldman Sachs at the end of last year after 26 years, but 70% of our staff were millennials or Gen Z. I had young men in the last few years come up to me and ask me more questions about work-life balance than their female peers. And it wasn't work-life balance, they asked life and a little bit of work was their context, right? So I think these changing attitudes of millennial males is really going to help propel Japan forward because they care about very different values than the previous generations. Number two, this is a space I'm very active in, is ESG investing, environment, social, and governance investing. It started in Europe, then moved to America, and finally came to the shores of Japan. But it's exploding in Japan. And what does that mean? That means even if you are a skeptic as a CEO about diversity, guess what? If you don't have any women on your board, you are now going to be asked that question by your shareholders. You're now going to be asked that question in not just governance aspects, but the social component of ESG as well. In other words, this directly hits your cost of capital. This will directly impact potentially your share price. And so it's no longer something you can hide behind or escape from. It is now front and center. So those two things I think make me optimistic.
And if these things are front and center, it's in no small way thanks to you and what you've been talking about, and based on these economic data for all these years. So we owe you a great deal of thanks for that. The new initiative of Asia Society Southern California of Asian Women Empowered, I think you are an absolute epitome. It spells awe. Well, you're awesome. And I think that as a diversity visionary and an astonishing woman, I know you're off now to new horizons, and we are all looking forward to what's next for Kathy Matsui. And we thank you for everything you've done this far. Thank you very much, and congratulations.
Thank you, Carol.